good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming today to our Meet the Scientist series. I think I'm the first one for the year. And today I'll be talking about salt marshes, what their current status is in Southern Maine, and what the Wells Reserve and our partners are doing to conserve and protect them. So you are here at the Wells National Estuarine Research Reserve at Lodholm Farm, unless you are watching this recording at home on your computer. And here at the Wells Reserve, we work with coastal communities in Southern Maine to protect, conserve, and restore coastal ecosystems and habitats to benefit the wildlife, the flora and fauna, and the people and communities who live in them or near them. So the topic today is salt marshes, and I'm going to give a little overview of salt marshes in Southern Maine. I'm going to talk about some of the planning that the Wells Reserve and our partners do around salt marsh conservation, and then I'm going to talk about a couple of our current projects. So according to the Maine Natural Areas Program, there's approximately 2,750 acres of salt marsh in Southern Maine, south of Casco Bay and north of New Hampshire. And that's in green. Yes, we have a lot of salt marsh in Southern Maine. We have a lot of low elevation coastline, which is left over after the glaciers receded several thousand years ago. It's a wide, flat area, which is quite a bit different if you've traveled in other parts of Maine. It's a lot less hilly down here, and because of that, we have these nice big salt marshes with the second largest salt marsh, contiguous salt marsh in Maine, is just here in the Wells Reserve, the Webb Hanna Estuary. And the salt marshes are important for a variety of reasons. Number one, they provide important habitat for a number of species, including some that are entirely dependent on the salt marsh. And this is an example of one. This is a salt marsh sparrow. You're looking at a nest of sparrows from 2024 monitoring that was done by the University of New Hampshire in cooperation with the Wells Reserve and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And then this is also a picture of a female salt marsh sparrow who had been caught in a mist net, and they are collecting some data on. In addition to a place for wildlife, salt marshes provide very important functions, including buffering our coastlines from erosion, absorbing floodwaters from storm surge, coastal storms, filtering nutrients from runoff. They provide wonderful places for recreation, including bird watching, kayaking, and the list goes on. This is a picture from the Webb Hanna Marsh. You can just see a major congregation of wading birds down there picking fish out of the pools. Salt marshes are increasingly at risk everywhere in the world due to sea level rise. Sea level rise is accelerating. That's what our data and our models show. And that is due primarily to inputs of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, which are driving increases in global temperature, which are then resulting in the melting of our ice sheets. There are other reasons why sea level rise changes at much smaller scales, including rebounding land, having the ice sheets recede, and slowly over time the land has been rising in places. So there's different things that contribute to that, but what we know is that that this is occurring, and it's having an outsized impact on our salt marshes. Salt marshes have responded to historic changes in sea level, and they do that through the process known as coastal transgression, where sediment is moved from the near shore through waves and storms onto our beaches, and in some places onto the land and the salt marshes. And over time, salt marshes build elevation in response to increases in sea level. But the accelerated rate at which sea level is rising now is much faster in some places than our salt marshes are able to keep up with. And so that's creating some problems. And in addition to that, we have a long history of using our salt marshes here in New England and in other parts of the country and the world. Here's just a couple of papers that have come out recently that look at this issue, and specifically looking at the legacy of ditching and diking in our salt marshes, which began with European arrival. They were bringing farming techniques from Europe that had been established for hundreds of years before they ever got to North America. And they brought those techniques here and they started turning the salt marshes into agricultural fields. It was a lot easier to do that than cutting down forests and creating those agricultural fields, though they did do that eventually. So salt marshes were early farms when the Europeans arrived. And there's a long history, hundreds of years of farming in salt marshes, and the legacy, even though we don't really see salt marsh farming that much anymore, the legacy of those alterations remains on the landscape today. So, yes. So what they were doing was they were essentially building embankments to prevent the tidal water from getting into the fields because they were growing farm crops, so crops that wouldn't tolerate salt water. And so they're essentially converting salt marsh into fields, somewhat wet fields, but they were growing certain crops that could grow in those areas and would be sort of wet tolerant, but not salt tolerant. So they really were trying to exclude the tidal flooding as much as possible. And they did a really good job of it. I would say all of our salt marshes in New England were at one time in agriculture. I don't think anybody could identify a single location where there wasn't some kind of agricultural use on our salt marshes today. But they're still beautiful places. And when we stand there and we look out at them, we think, oh, what a wonderful natural landscape. A lot of these features are hidden. They have subsided into the marsh. They're, embankments that were once 3 or 4 feet tall are now only inches tall, and they're covered with salt marsh vegetation. So they're hard to pick out. But we know that they're there and we can identify them by looking at historical imagery. So here's an example of a photograph that was taken from an airplane circa 1930, 1935, somewhere in that range, by the Portland Water District. And these photos were recovered from, I believe, the Portland Public Library by a colleague. And this is an image of Cape Elizabeth. You can see the salt marsh in the lower left-hand corner of the image. That is the Spurwink Marsh in Cape Elizabeth. And you can see sort of the darker, well, you can see the line of the tidal channels, and then you can see sort of darker areas around them that are maybe a little bit wetter. And then adjacent to those, you can see what are clearly fields. And the fields go right down to the salt marsh. And so this would have been kind of near the end of the period of time where people were harvesting salt hay. So there wouldn't have been as much active farming in the salt marshes, but you can imagine what it would have been like over the last several hundred years as farmers expanded their fields, and they would have extended right down essentially to the water's edge in the salt marsh. This is a neat photo because it also shows some of the early roads that were built to cross the tidal creeks in the salt marsh. You can see one right in the middle of the screen. That is Spurwink Avenue, what is now Spurwink Avenue in Cape Elizabeth. And then on the very left edge in the middle, you can see another road crossing, and that's what's now Sawyer Road in the Spurwink Marsh, and that's the boundary between Scarborough and Cape Elizabeth. So this kind of historical, there's not a lot of images like this in Maine. We're really fortunate to have this record that goes this far back. There are other types of records, such as USGS topographic maps that go back to the late 1800s. There are written accounts that farmers and their families kept of their operations. Some people were meticulous and kept detailed journals about all of the work that they did on their farms. And we have colleagues that have really mined that material to understand how salt marshes were being used historically. We can still see the evidence of this work today in our salt marshes. This is a picture from the Little River here at the Wells Reserve. There's a couple things in this photo. You can see this wooden structure that's in the tidal channel here. This was a water control structure. So they would have built this to block the water coming in as the tide came in, and then it would have allowed, it had a mechanism that would allow fresh water to drain out. And then you can sort of see extending towards the top left corner of the photo, a linear feature, which is a raised embankment, and that embankment led right up to this water control structure. So just imagine in your head, back 100 or 200 years, there was a large earthen berm and it connected to a wooden water control structure like a sluice gate. And everything behind that was being farmed by the farmers. This is a really neat. Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
yeah. Oh,
Like it's right now. So that's
and
what you said was there then, right?
it was some type of structure. I don't know exactly what it would have looked like. Exactly. Yep.
See.
Yep. And this is a colleague, this is Jeff Wilson at Northeast Wetland Restoration. And Jeff is one of the folks who has done a lot of the research on farmers and farming in marshes. Here's another shot. This is that same embankment, but on the other side of the creek extending south, and you can just see how big it is. I mean, it's at least 10 or 12 feet wide, and it extends hundreds of feet across the salt marsh. So these features are still out there today, and they're causing a lot of issues, including creating ponded areas on the surface of the salt marsh that cause vegetation to die off. And then as the vegetation dies and the root zone collapses, more water is allowed to pool on the surface of the marsh. And it's just a cycle that allows these pools to expand over time. You can see some of the larger pools on the surface of the salt marsh there.
Do you have a restoration uh, effort to not have that just continue on?
We do.
Okay.
We will get,
Don't be looking for.
we will get to that. Yes, it's a good question. It's an obvious question. So I talked about sea level rise, and so I'm just going to share this graph that my colleague here at the reserve, Jeremy Miller, put together after the two record-setting storms in January 2024. This is water level data from our station at Wells Harbor. And the blue line that's going up and down there are the tidal fluctuations. The red line was the highest previous tide recorded, which was from January 4th, 2018 at this station. And you can see the peaks on January 10th and January 13th when that elevation was exceeded by those two back-to-back storms that we had. So we're seeing record-breaking water levels affecting our estuaries and our coastline. This is not a picture from during that storm. Obviously, wouldn't have been out flying our drone in that, but this is an aerial image that we picked up during a king tide, I want to say 2022. So this is looking at Wells Harbor. And what's notable here is that if you're familiar with Wells Harbor, there's something that you can't see there that you normally can, which is basically the entire salt marsh, which is underwater. With the exception of the marsh that's in the foreground, that is the 30-acre marsh upstream of the self-regulating tide gate on Drake's Island Road. And you can see the tide gate is doing its job, keeping the water out and keeping the marsh from being inundated. The marsh here in the 30-acre marsh on Drake's Island is about 3 feet lower than the marsh in the main Webhanna estuary. And so the tide gate is actually performing a really valuable function by not allowing the marsh to be flooded to the extent that it would be if the tides were coming in. I'm not going to get into the history of the tide gate. It's a little bit complicated, but it is interesting to see that it's able to keep out these really extreme tides. And in some ways that is protecting this little bit of marsh. So big tides, sea level rise are having an impact on our marshes. They're flooding them longer and more frequently, and that's causing changes in the vegetation, which then leads to, in some places, collapse of the salt marsh. We have other evidence of sea level rise affecting our marshes and the adjacent areas. This is a picture again from Drake's Island, a different part of Drake's Island marsh. And you can see this is summertime, but there's a few trees here that don't have leaves on them, and that's because they're dead. And this is what we refer to as a ghost forest. And so these are trees that have been experiencing increased tidal flooding. They're species that are not salt tolerant. And so over time, as the soil becomes more salty, they die. And so this is an area that we would expect over time would revert to salt marsh with sea level rise. And I say revert because it probably was salt marsh in the past. And if you are starting to look at the salt marsh a little bit more critically, you may see a linear feature in the foreground that's running towards that prominent tree. That's probably an embankment. And so in addition to the alteration of the salt marshes that we see today, likely a lot of the low elevation red maple swamps that we have surrounding our salt marshes are probably there because there are legacy embankments that are still holding back the salt water. And so they're creating conditions that are favorable for those coastal freshwater forests to survive. And if the embankments weren't there, these areas would probably be salt marsh. And so part of what we are now looking at is not only the farming infrastructure that's in the marshes themselves, but also looking at the adjacent forest area and thinking about how we can facilitate the migration of these marshes with sea level rise. Okay, so that's a little bit about the current status of our marshes. And now I'm going to talk about the work that goes into planning for conservation in these important habitats. So the Wells Reserve has been doing coastal habitat and salt marsh restoration for a long time. I started doing this work back in around 2017. And at that time, we partnered with the Nature Conservancy in Maine to start looking at high priority sites in Southern Maine and working with our coastal communities to find places where they had priority projects associated with coastal roads and where those priorities intersected with our priorities for salt marsh. So we did a number of different activities. We did some desktop-based analyses using maps and GIS. We did outreach to community municipal staff, including Department of Public Works directors, community planners, and we started writing grants and helping these communities to get funding to replace some of this failing infrastructure. At the same time, we were working on a project with a number of partners in Maine to start to develop better guidance for how to design roads and road crossings in tidal environments. And that project is known as Coastwise, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. We worked closely back in from about 2017 to 2020 with the town of York. We helped them write 4 successful grants to the Maine DEP Stream Crossing Improvement Program. They were very great. They were great to work with. I would call up the director there, Dean Lessard, and he would say, you know, I've got these culverts, let's go out and look at them. So we go drive around, we'd look at crossings, and then I'd say, you know, let him know which ones I thought would be a good fit. And that resulted in a number of great culvert upgrades. The top 3 crossings that you can see on the right-hand side here were all constructed by the town of York with state funds. I don't have a before picture for the second one from the top, but you can see what these structures look like. So the top one is on Moulton Brook on Route 91 in York, and that's the failing, rotted out metal culvert on the left, and then the nice big bottomless concrete span that they put in on the right-hand side. And similar story, old metal corrugated pipes perched above the stream, blocking fish and other aquatic organisms from going back and forth. And they were replaced with nice open bottom structures that allow natural stream substrate and complete aquatic organism passage. And then another project down in the bottom, which I'll talk a little bit more about in Cape Elizabeth on a stream called Willow Brook. So here's just another picture of the Molten Brook crossing in York. This was a tidal crossing, not a lot of salt marsh upstream, but the town was planning to replace this. They needed to because the culvert was failing. And so we decided, a lot of times the restoration work that we do is opportunistic. We may have a list of priorities that we'd like to work on, but because we don't own that infrastructure, we're relying on partnerships. And so if our partners have a different priority, then, then we'll work with them on the crossings that they're interested in working on. So this was one that York was already planning to replace. Here's that crossing in Cape Elizabeth. So in 2017, we helped the town of Cape Elizabeth get a grant to assess their major road stream crossings in their town. We conducted field surveys of the condition of these crossings. We looked at the available data on wildlife habitat, and we made a prioritized list. And then since that time, we've been sort of checking off the crossings on the list, and this was the #1 priority that came out. This crossing is actually not on a road; it's on a municipal right-of-way that carries the 2 major sewer lines for the town of Cape Elizabeth. So sewer is run by the Portland Water District in Cape Elizabeth, and the sewer lines actually ran across the top. They still run across the top of the culvert. And so the fear was that if the culverts were to fail catastrophically, that would imperil these major sewer lines, and that would then release untreated sewage into the estuary. So this was a real major concern, and we worked with the town to conduct some modeling of tidal conditions, including sea level rise. We worked with an engineering firm called Acadia Civil Works, and another firm that works for the town directly as their engineering services consultant, Sebago Technics. And they designed this crossing to accommodate a certain amount of sea level rise. I think they designed it for 3 feet of sea level rise by the year 2100. They designed it to have an open bottom. You can see that it's not a complete box. It has it's essentially an arch. And this crossing will allow tidal flow back and forth while minimizing what we call hydraulic head differential. So that's essentially as water is passing through a culvert from one side to the other, there's a difference in the water level. And we try to minimize that difference because the bigger the difference is, the higher the velocity of the water is coming through that culvert, and it causes the upstream or the downstream side to scour, and it can degrade habitat. Also, that restriction, that difference in water level, also means that the full tidal flow is not getting to the upstream habitat, and so that's one of the reasons why we have salt marshes that are converting to fresh water because they're not getting that full tidal flooding. So this culvert was designed with that in mind, and this project was funded through our state in lieu fee program called the Maine Natural Resource Conservation Program.
This relates on all Maine, but how does that work? Like, it's just like if a town, like, where does like federal funding of like roads and rebuilding this come into play?
Yeah, the funding landscape is complicated. So it kind of depends on what the goals of the project are. A lot of road crossing work is done just because it's a road safety issue, and it doesn't really have a lot of habitat value per se. Other projects like this one and some of the others that I'm going to talk about have really high habitat value, and there's multiple components, multiple reasons why you might want to do one of these projects. So for example, if a road is crossing a large area of salt marsh and it's restricting flow to, let's say, 20 or 30 acres of salt marsh upstream, that's a significant amount of habitat. So that if you were to address the issue at that road and allow tidal flow to reach those areas, you would be able to benefit a much larger area than, say, a culvert that only had, several hundred square feet of tidal marsh upstream. Like the first example that I showed, Molten Brook, it was tidal. It did have tidal flooding going through it, but it had a very, very small amount of salt marsh upstream. So the habitat there is not, it's still valuable, but it's not as important, relatively speaking, as some other sites might be.
What, like, to be private?
Yeah, yep. They own the infrastructure. It's their responsibility for maintaining it. So it is up to them to decide. But there are numerous organizations and agencies who have an interest in seeing these projects be as beneficial as they can be for habitat. And so that's part of what we do is we approach these communities and we talk to them about what their priorities are. And when there's a, sort of a synergy between what they're most interested in and what we're most interested in, that's when we identify a really good project. And that's when we try to start working together. I will also say that these projects aren't just happening in isolation. There are regulations that govern how these projects can be done. And there are agencies who oversee these projects. And so the Maine Department of Environmental Protection and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers are both organizations who are making sure that these projects aren't harming the environment any more than they already do. A town can simply, if they have a failing culvert, they are able to simply replace it in the same configuration that it already is. So if you have a small pipe and it fails, you can put another small pipe back in. But what we know about how this infrastructure is impacted by flooding is that if you have a culvert that's failing, it's getting washed out or eroded because of the amount of flow that's trying to go through it. If it's undersized, we know that that's going to keep happening. And ideally, infrastructure like a culvert, a tidal culvert, a freshwater culvert, ideally that would last for 60, 70, maybe even 100 years. And some of the culverts we have in our landscape are that old. And
Where they don't even have culverts, they totally block it.
yeah.
There's no water flow.
So there's benefits to improving these structures other than the habitat. It reduces costs over time. They can replace it once and pay for it one time instead of having to replace it or maintain it multiple times over the course of its life. Sometimes it's hard to, it is more expensive to upgrade these structures and make them bigger and more resilient to sea level rise and increased water levels. Exactly. Yep. Making a bridge instead of putting in a culvert with a lot of fill is a lot more expensive. So it takes a certain amount of faith and forward thinking to decide to spend that money. And that's another way that we can help, and other organizations like the Wells Reserve, is we can help identify grants and bring that money in so that the communities don't have to bear all of the cost to make those improvements.
You only serve.
Well, we primarily work in Southern Maine. The service area that I work in is from the Piscataqua River to Cape Elizabeth.
Maine working on like down east and other places on the coast.
Yeah. Yep. There are state and federal agencies that work throughout Maine. There are other private nonprofit organizations. There are other organizations that receive federal funding but are not federal employees, like the National Estuaries programs. So in Casco Bay, we have the Casco Bay Estuary Program. They do a lot of the same type of work. Organizations like Maine Coast Heritage Trust, the Down East Salmon Federation, various land trusts, the Maine Department of Marine Resources, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, NOAA. Yeah, there are increasingly more organizations that are doing this work because it's not just about the habitat, it's also about community resilience. And so there's this real synergy that we're all trying to capitalize on and work together so that we can maximize benefits for habitat and for people and communities. Yeah, good questions. Okay, so I mentioned Coastwise. This is a program that was developed by the Maine Coastal Program, which is another partner that works in tidal environments, as well as several other organizations. Over the span of about 6 years, we worked together to develop a manual of best practices for designing road crossings in tidal environments. These projects can be very complicated. There's a lot of different factors to consider, and we wanted to create a guide for communities that are working potentially on their own or haven't created partnerships yet, to give them some idea of what might be involved to upgrade their infrastructure and improve habitat in their communities. Here is a map from the Maine Tidal Restriction Atlas. This is an online mapping tool that was developed by Maine Coastal Program, which identifies most of the tidal road crossings, railroad crossings, trail crossings, and dams in the state of Maine. And it additionally also identifies those that would become tidal under different sea level rise scenarios. So it's a really great resource. It's built on another database that was created by partners in Maine looking at freshwater stream crossings, called the Maine Stream Crossing Survey. But this tool specifically focuses on coastal tidal crossings, and Maine Coastal Program conducted additional analyses to identify which crossings were associated with salt marshes, which crossings were potentially tidal restrictions. So they took that original data set, they narrowed it down to just those that are in tidal areas, and then they conducted some additional analysis. So this is a really helpful tool that we point communities to better understand the tidal crossings that are in their communities. And I've been talking a lot about road crossings. Not all of the salt marsh restoration work that we do is associated with road crossings, though a lot of it is. And this is a really helpful diagram that was put together by Interfluve. It's an engineering consultant that helped us develop these guidelines. This is very technical information, and so we hired experts that could come in and help us explain this in the most complete way possible. So on the top of this diagram here, you can see what we would consider to be a relatively unrestricted tidal crossing, and you can see a diagram of the crossing itself. And then you can also see what we call the hydrograph. That's the tidal water levels going up as the tides come in and then going back down and passing through that culvert. The blue line is an unrestricted hydrograph, and the red dashed line is the restricted hydrograph. And so you can then see as the culvert gets smaller, what happens to those water levels as the size decreases. And so the blue line would be the ideal curve, and the red line is the actual curve. And you can see as the crossing size gets smaller, that upstream water level gets lower and lower and lower. So if anybody has any questions about this, I'll be happy to answer it, but I'm going to move on. I don't want it to get too technical. Absolutely. Yep. And we've built, roads for hundreds of years in these coastal areas, and we're just now starting to really understand what the impacts are and starting to do something about them. Another planning process that the Wells Reserve has been involved with was called Climate Ready Coast Southern Maine. We worked with Southern Maine Planning and Development Commission to support the development of a regional coastal resilience plan for 10 communities in Southern Maine. And this was in order to provide support for, again, planning for natural resource conservation and community resilience. It included the development of what we call a vulnerability assessment, where we brought in mapping data, created these overlays and identified areas in each of these communities that were vulnerable to coastal flooding and sea level rise, and where those vulnerable areas intersected with either critical infrastructure or high value habitat. So we created a series of maps and an online viewer, so another online mapping tool. That's a common theme in the work that we do. And this is actually available online. If you just do a internet search for climate ready coast, Southern Maine, you can pull this up if you want. And really data rich viewer that, ultimately we don't really know how many communities are actually using this tool, but those of us that are working with these communities, I personally and others that I work with use these tools pretty heavily. So they've been very, very useful. This project involved a lot of engagement with these towns to identify where the priority vulnerable areas were in their communities. And then we went the next step to actually try to develop some conceptual designs for what some coastal adaptation strategies in those areas might look like. And there's been a number of projects that have come out of Climate Ready Southern Maine, including one that was recently completed that was led by my colleague Chris Fort, who's here in the room today. It was called Marshes for Maine's Future. I should say Marshes for Maine's Future continues, but this initial iteration of the project involved working with scientists at the U.S. Geological Survey, who had developed yet another online tool and data set for looking at the condition of our marshes. And they were looking at sort of multiple things, but two primary data sets that we were looking at. One was called the unvegetated to vegetated ratio. And all that was looking at salt marshes, sort of drawing a little line around them to create an area, and then looking at how much of the marsh in that area was vegetated, had plants growing on it, and how much of it didn't. And what they found in their research is that there's a direct relationship between UVVR, this ratio, and the expected life of the salt marshes. And once that ratio reaches a certain threshold, there's a tipping point where you can expect that the salt marsh will eventually fall apart. In addition to the UVVR, and here's just an example of what the tool looks like. So they've created these, chopped up the marsh into these little units, and then they calculated the UVVR value, which you can see in the legend there on the left. In addition to that, they also created a tool called the lifespan calculator. And I won't go into a lot of detail about that, but basically it gives you a ballpark idea about how long it would take for any given area of the marsh to just go completely underwater and no longer be vegetated.
What is that? What is it, like 100 years from now?
Yeah.
50, 20?
In some cases, thousands of years. But the trick with that tool, and I'm glad you asked that, is when we're interpreting that for people who weren't part of the project, it's important to say that what that means is that you might have a 50-acre area of salt marsh today, and the lifespan calculator might say it's going to be there for 500 years. But what that means is at that 500-year mark, there's this much salt marsh left. So over that 500 years, the salt marsh is gradually, the sea level rise is increasing. And so what it's doing is it's cannibalizing itself to maintain elevation above sea level. So they're basically looking at the total amount of sediment. So our salt marshes are built on top of significant amounts of marsh peat and sediment. And so they're calculating the volume of sediment and they're looking at the rate of sea level rise. And they're basically saying, if you can keep moving, if the marsh moves sediment from one place and it piles it up in another over time, there's this much time left before it would just all be underwater. That's a layperson's, sort of a semi-layperson's explanation, but I don't actually claim to completely understand it myself. Question?
Of those water pools that just now sit
Yeah.
throughout the tide cycle, that would then have a very, very high
UVVR.
correct?
Exactly. Yep. So very low vegetation, very high unvegetated area. I'm going to speed up a little bit because I'm spending a lot of time talking about these tools. And what I really wanted to show you was what we're actually doing. So I'm actually going to, and I'll answer some questions at the end, but I do want to share with. Yes, this is being recorded. And so you can see the rest of the presentation online. It's going to be on the Wells Reserve YouTube channel.
YouTube.com/local.
Yep. And my contact information is on the people section of the website. So if you have any questions, you want to follow up, feel free. Yeah, great. Thanks for coming.
Yeah.
So I have a couple slides in here just about some of the methods that we use for collecting data in our marshes. You're going to see a lot of aerial imageries that we've collected with our drone. This is not ours specifically, but this is the model that we use. It's called a DJI Mavic 2. And it's a really helpful tool for mapping and for understanding what's going on in our salt marshes. We also do a lot of work on the ground, collecting vegetation data, collecting groundwater data. My colleagues, Bonnie and Sam in the middle there, are driving a groundwater well into the marsh. And then we use GPS equipment to do survey work to try to identify elevations of the marsh and water levels. Okay, so here we are today, current projects. I'm going to talk about two major projects that we're working on. The first is the Spurwink Marsh restoration in Cape Elizabeth. This is a tidal crossing on Sawyer Road. This is the boundary between Cape Elizabeth and Scarborough. So we're actually working with two communities on this project. There's about 1,400 feet of roadway that crosses the salt marsh. And you saw it in that historical photo. Here's a quick funding acknowledgement. We always want to thank our funders. So Maine Natural Resource Conservation Program and NOAA have provided most of the funding for the work that's been done so far, in addition to some funding that came from the Maine Coastal Program. So here's a picture of the road. This is what we call sunny day flooding. As you can see, it's a sunny day, so there's not a storm going on. This is just a regular high tide that's covering the road. I have some videos of cars driving through it. This is increasingly happening as sea level increases. And this road is obviously at a very low elevation, right? So that's why this happens a lot. So we talked about that Willow Brook site. This is the second priority. And now that they've dealt with that sewer line, now they're going to deal with this road. And remarkably, this community is thinking really far in advance about what's going to happen to their coastal roads. They actually have two roads that we showed in that historical photo, Spurwink Avenue to the east and Sawyer Road to the west. This community, they went through a feasibility study. They got cost estimates for what it would take to keep this road above sea level for the next 75 years. And they decided that it was too expensive and that they had another road, Spurwink Avenue, that has their sewer line and other utilities. It's a more heavily used road. And they said to themselves, if we had $5 million to spend to upgrade a road, would we spend it here or would we spend it someplace else? And the answer was someplace else. So amazingly, these two towns, Scarborough and Cape Elizabeth, they had a joint town council meeting where the leaders of both communities got together to talk about this. They also had community members there to provide input, and they voted to remove this road, which is just remarkable because you don't really hear about people actively discontinuing and removing roads. This is a unique location. This can't happen everywhere, but they have several other roads that they can use to get through town. And so they decided it's just not worth it. Let's get rid of it. So we worked with them to identify grants. The Maine Natural Resource Conservation Program awarded the town of Cape Elizabeth $1.8 million. It's the largest award that this program has ever made in their history. And we are currently working with the town now to plan for the removal of this road, as well as the enhancement of the adjacent salt marshes to try to address those legacy impacts from agricultural use. This summer, we're going to be out in the field collecting what we call pre-restoration data. That's a baseline condition that allows us to then evaluate the success of the restoration as the project moves forward in the future. Here again, this is another of the Portland Water District aerial photos from the 1930s, and I've drawn a white box around Sawyer Road. You can see there's a characteristic signature of a tidal restriction at the crossing. It's this sort of dumbbell shape or hourglass shape around the crossing where you have these scour pools. on either side that are much wider than the rest of the tidal channel. Whenever you see that at a crossing, that's an indication that the structure is undersized. It's causing increased velocity through that crossing, and that increased velocity is what scours out those large pools. So this crossing, and this is almost 100 years ago, so this was in place even at that time. And of course, you can see all the farming that's going on around it. All of this landscape is forested now, and there's homes, so it looks quite different. This is a photo from the 2024 storm. Somebody decided to drive their car across, and the tidal flow swept it into the salt marsh, and they actually had to be rescued by boat. These photos, I had photo credit in here. I'm not sure where it went, but this comes from WGME CBS Channel 13, I believe. So obviously there's a real problem here. It's not just about long-term capital investments. It's not just about coastal habitat. It's also about public safety. And obviously we don't want that type of thing happening. This is just a slide that shows some of the work that we've done to map some of the farming infrastructure in the marsh. The blue lines are ditches and the red lines are embankments. This is all done from aerial imagery. This is not data that's collected in the field. This is the approach that's typically taken. First, we map with historical photos, and then we go out and we try to identify these features in the field. And you can see the ponding of water on the marsh surface there in the photo. Okay, so that's the Spermink Marsh project. In the last 10 minutes or so here, I'm going to talk about our other project that we're currently working on in the town of Wells. This is a site on Drake's Island Road where the town owns a bridge that is failing and needs to be replaced. And there's a small, about 10-acre salt marsh upstream that's been impacted by the tidal restriction at the bridge and by farming historically. And we're looking towards Wells Harbor and the Webhanet River in this photo. Another funding acknowledgement. So this project received an award. The town of Wells received approximately $2.8 million through the bipartisan infrastructure law, which formerly known as the Infrastructure Investments and Jobs Act. In addition to that funding, the Wells Reserve has also received award through a cooperative agreement with NOAA and the Office for Coastal Management. And so that's also funding some of the work at the site. So here's a picture of the bridge. It's an old timber crib structure. We think this dates back to the 1930s, so maybe 100 years old. And it's starting to fail pretty spectacularly, and the town has to replace it. So prior to getting this award from NOAA, the town had actually bonded for about $300,000 to conduct a study of the site and to start developing designs for a replacement. They're working with a firm called CMA Engineers, who also subcontracted with another engineering company called GZA Consultants, who have done a lot of the modeling work that was used to develop the designs for this site. Here is a diagram of the structure that's in place now. This is the plan view drawings that were developed by the Maine Department of Transportation back in the 1930s. So this is a technical drawing that would have been used as part of the construction process for the site. But one of the things that I think is interesting in this drawing is that you see these larger font, bold names at all four corners where you have the river and then the road. So each quadrant of this map has somebody's name on it. And I don't know if you can see it from there, but in the top left, it's Charles F. Spiller Marsh. And in the top right, it's Lewis Marsh. The bottom left is George Lord Pasture. And in the bottom right, it's Frank Clark Marsh. And these are all names, if you know the history of Wells and the Wells Reserve, these are names that are associated with this property in this area. This is, the reason that their names are on this is because they were farming in this marsh, and they owned it and they used it, and that's why the names are associated with it. So this DOT drawing from the 1930s gives us a little bit of a picture of how the marsh was being used at that time. And interestingly, you can see this sort of cross-hatched area sort of in the middle of the picture. DOT actually created a channel diversion. They tried to straighten the channel at this one location. And we still see evidence of that out there, though it's been mostly eroded away now. So here's some photos from the site. You can see the linear features that look like they were probably embankments at one point in time, as well as the ponded areas that they're creating that have lost vegetation. So water on the marsh. Here's another aerial image from our drone that shows the site. You can see that there's just a lot of degradation going on. A massive mega pool in the middle there that has formed over time, as well as areas that look like they're slowly becoming unvegetated. Interestingly, there's also a couple of areas that look like they're restoring themselves over time. In the lower right here, you can see an old oxbow from where the channel used to run, and that's actually growing in with vegetation. So we think that this structure that they put in the 1930s or 1940s was actually bigger than the one that was there originally. And so over time, the more sediment has been allowed to come up through there, and that some of these areas are starting to restore themselves, which is kind of interesting. So we are very pleased as part of this project that we can say officially now that the Wells Reserve purchased a conservation easement, which was funded through the BIL award, on approximately 19 acres of land. It was purchased from a neighbor here who owned most of the salt marsh, as well as some of the surrounding uplands. And that area is now part of the Wells Reserve. We have a permanent conservation easement there, which is going to allow us to do the restoration work that we're planning to do in the salt marsh. It was really delightful to work with these folks. They were very committed to the goals of the project. They were very happy that this would be part of the legacy of their ownership of the site. One of the folks involved with the project actually grew up here, so it was a very personal project for them. So that's just been like one of the early success stories and milestones of the project, as we now have that conservation easement at this site. Okay, so work continues at these locations, and I just wanted to give you a little preview. We haven't actually done any of the restoration work yet. All of that is going to proceed in the next couple of years. We're working on designs, we're working on getting permits, we're collecting data, pre-restoration baseline data. But I did want to give you a little preview of some of the techniques that we might be using. So this is a site on Drake's Island Marsh in a different location where U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has done some restoration work. And so they created what's called a runnel, which you can sort of see in the foreground. It's a very shallow drainage pathway that allows water to run off the marsh surface. And then that exposed sediment over time is going to revegetate. And as the plants grow roots and rhizomes, they will build below ground biomass that will actually raise the surface of the marsh. And those plants will also be actively trapping sediment, which will also increase the elevation of the marsh. So the hope is that this area will start to recover over the next couple of years. This was done just in 2024. Here's a close-up of what one of those runnels looks like. So again, these were hand dug, so no machinery was used to do this. Very basic, simple techniques, but they've been shown to work really well in other places. Here's another example. I don't know off the top of my head what site this is from. This is a technique known as ditch remediation. So in addition to oversaturation of the marsh surface, we also have very tight networks of ditches that were dug. And when there's too much drainage in a marsh, that causes an oxidation of the marsh peat. Microorganisms start devouring that organic material like crazy, and the marshes can collapse because of that. And so the way that you address that issue is by adding cut salt hay in bundles or in bales to the bottom of these ditches. Those bales of vegetation then trap sediment and allow low marsh vegetation like Spartina alterniflora to start growing. That vegetation then in turn traps more sediment, and the elevation builds over time. And eventually you have a ditch and they do a couple treatments over time too. So they're adding more material as time goes on. And eventually you get something that looks kind of like this. This is material that's been added and staked down, but eventually this is going to grow in and become hopefully a healed ditch. I don't know. I stole this from somebody else's presentation. Full disclosure. Okay, so last thing I'm going to show you. So this, again, this is Drake's Island Marsh. This is just south of the site that was just put into conservation. And I want to point out a couple things. So first, in the foreground, you see this really impounded area, a lot of water on the marsh surface. And then in the bottom right-hand corner of the picture, you can see a linear embankment that actually has some shrubs growing on it. So U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service got funding to remove that embankment, that berm, redistribute the material from that berm into the adjacent pool. And they also this is the first time this is ever done as a pilot project to take sediment from Wells Harbor. So the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers dredged the harbor in 2023 and 2024. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service was allowed to stockpile, I want to say, about 800 cubic yards of that material. So they stockpiled that off site. And then they were allowed by the U.S. Army Corps and by Maine DEP over the winter to bring that sediment back onto the marsh in what's called a thin layer placement or sediment addition project to try to build up the elevation of the marsh so that it can withstand sea level rise over time. So I'm going to show you a couple of pictures from this spring after the work was done. In this picture, you can still see that linear berm feature, but now it's been cut down to the elevation of the surrounding marsh. It looked quite bad in this photo, I would say, but over the summer, we expect this area to start growing in, and I think hopefully it'll look much nicer by the end of the summer. And then this is where the sand was put down. So they actually had some equipment out there on the marsh using pressure mats to make sure that we weren't compressing the marsh too much. And then they put all this nice sand down after it was sifted to get out larger materials. And this too is expected to vegetate in over the course of the growing season. And by the end of the summer, we hope there will be some amount of salt marsh vegetation growing here. And over the course of the next few years, we expect that this would all completely vegetate in. So again, these are projects that are being done by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Rachel Carson National Wildlife Refuge, our neighbors. And very exciting to have all of this work going on in our backyard. A lot of neat stuff happening here in the Webb Hannock Marsh. And with that, we've gotten to our hour and the end of my presentation. And this is from the winter time. So sorry about that, but it's our I Heart Estuaries photo that we took with our drone, all of us standing out there in the winter, making a little heart. So thank you all for coming. Thank you very much.